So I made my title nice and general because my group is interested in several different aspects of proton exchange membrane fuel cells. But what I thought I'd talk about today, since I'm a trained physical chemist, I'm interested in structure function. So I'm going to tell you about some experiments that we do to try and understand the proton conducting channels in the membranes that make up proton exchange membrane fuel cells. And since it's a short talk, I'll make sure and acknowledge the people who actually did the work. All of the stuff that I'm going to talk about today was done by Nick Economou, who's a recent PhD student in my group. And the funding began with the Army Research Office, and then we were part of a MURI and then taken over by the NSF. Okay, but before I get into the technique and some of the data, I was asked to set the stage a little bit and define the problem and the experiments that we are going to do to try and solve it. And so for most of you, you know that the proton exchange membrane fuel cell is an energy converting technology. You convert energy from the fuel into electricity. And this is done by use of an electrochemical cell. The technology performs very well relative to others. It's high efficiency if you do it correctly and reasonably high current density. It has some disadvantages, and the efficiencies aren't up to what they could be, and it's also very expensive, and that has to do mostly with the catalyst and the membrane. And so we're interested in both the catalysis in these devices as well as the materials that make them up. But what I'm going to talk about today is the membrane and how we might make it more efficient. Okay, so a number of applications of fuel cells that are actually commercially available, stationary power systems, small power devices that can charge up small electronics, and of course automotive applications. Many of the car companies are releasing fuel cell cars, or cars that are run by stacks of fuel cells. And what I want to talk about is more of the fundamentals. What makes these things work? And so, just so we all know what I'm talking about in terms of a fuel cell, I thought I'd build one up. So you start with the guts, or if we have a sandwich, which is two electrodes, the meat of the sandwich is the membrane itself. And this is the heart of the proton exchange membrane fuel cell. It's a polymeric material. The state-of-the-art is Nafion. It's a DuPont polymer. It has a backbone that's essentially Teflon, fluorocarbon, and then a side chain that has a sulfonic acid group. And so what happens when this is cast into a film, and here's a film, this is 50 microns thick or thereabouts, is that this part phase separates from this part. The blue part here is hydrophobic. The white part here is hydrophilic with a very high acid concentration, negative pH. And so in an artist's rendition, this is the channels. Okay, so what I'm trying to represent here is there is an opening on one side, and then you find your way by some path to an opening on the far side. And perhaps, like a corn maze, you could find an opening on one side that doesn't connect to an opening on the other. We'll allow that possibility. Okay, so the blue part here is hydrophobic, and then the white part here would be the hydrophilic channels. Okay, so then to make a membrane electrode assembly, which is the heart of the fuel cell, you have to have two electrodes that sandwich the membrane. And these two electrodes I will talk about in detail a little bit, but have a carbon cloth. So it's a carbon electrode on one side, a carbon electrode on the other, and these are hot pressed to the membrane itself. So these are stuck together. And here's a membrane electrode assembly. You can see the plasticky part here is the Teflon, and there's the carbon cloth electrode, and there's one exactly like it on the opposite side. Okay, so the electrode itself is two parts. First part is a carbon cloth gas diffusion layer, which gives the electrode some bulk. And this is what's connected to the wires that would actually power this device or extract power from it. And then it also has a catalyst layer. And the catalyst layer is where all the chemistry occurs. The oxidation and the reduction reactions that are part of this electrochemical cell. And in the catalyst layer is carbon black with platinum particles attached to it. So here's a SEM micrograph. And this sets the stage of the scale of this picture. So this is about 100 nanometers. This is about a 50 nanometer square box. So this length is about 50 nanometers, which would make these channels on the order of a nanometer scale. And so what I'm interested in, and my group has been interested in, is in the interface here between the catalyst layer and the membrane. And so we're interested in where these openings actually occur and what happens to them as the device operates, which usually means changing the water content of the membrane. Okay, so how the fuel cell works then is it's an electrochemical cell. So on the anode side is the oxidation reaction, which is oxidation of the fuel, in this case hydrogen. It could also be methanol, formic acid, ethanol. You create protons, and you create the protons at the platinum particles that then generates electrons and H+ ions that then are transported through the hydrophilic channels, and then the electrons go through the external circuit or the load. And then on the opposite side, you have the cathode reaction or the reduction reaction, which in this case is oxygen reduction. So oxygen from the air will react with the protons that are transported through the channel and the electrons that go through the load to form water. Okay, so what I'm going to show you now is our probing of this interface. And to do that, when we want the membrane side, is we'll actually remove the cathode electrode. And we'll probe the top side. On almost every experiment that I'm going to show you, we actually have the anode side, and there's a reason for that, which will become clear, I think, in a few minutes. Okay, so what we're interested in is probing this thing on the right length scale, which I told you was a nanometer scale. Cheryl in the previous, in her talk, talked about at least introduce the atomic force microscope, and that's what we're going to make use of to image the channels at the surface of the membrane. And so for those of you who don't know what the atomic force microscope is, it is a sensing device on the nanoscale with a pyramid, usually silicon nitride, at the end of a silicon dioxide cantilever. So this is a mechanical resonator. And so here's a picture of one of these tips. So this actually has a sharpened end on it. And this spot size down here is on the nanometer length scale. And so how you sense the surface is you run this mechanical resonance resonator at its resonance frequency, a few tens of kilohertz, and then you detect both the change in the amplitude and the change in the phase as it lightly touches the surface. So let's see if this image will, or this little cartoon can illustrate what's going on here. Okay, so how you detect this is you simply bounce a laser diode off the end, this top surface here, and then detect it with a phase sensitive or a position sensitive detector. And so then what's observed on the position sensitive detector is an oscillating signal. That's like this. And so the oscillating signal would be the dashed line here. That's the driving frequency. And then what is measured on the laser diode is this amplitude slightly phase shifted depending on the chemical specificity of what it's touching. So this mechanical resonator is lightly touching the surface, and when it touches something of different chemical identity, then you'll get a different phase shift. Okay, so the chemical information comes in the power dissipation, which we read out as this phase shift between the driving frequency and what is detected. The amplitude then is kept constant, and that's our feedback signal. And so we get an image of the topography of the film, and then we get an image of the phase shift, which tells us about the chemistry. Okay, so this would have one signal, which is denoted by the yellow or gold color, and then blue would be here. So two different identities, right? Hydrophilic and hydrophobic. So this should work very well for our films and give us a heterogeneous distribution of these two species. And here you go. This is what a typical phase image looks like of a Nafion film. So just so you know the contrast here, the darker regions are the hydrophilic channels, and then the hydrophobic regions are the fluorocarbon backbone, are the brighter spots. And you can see the resolution is very good, the sensitivity is excellent, and we have spot sizes that are of the order of a few nanometers to the order of a few tens of nanometers. And so, because we want to quantitate this, we can run some statistics based on these images, several of them. This particular film has 19.4% hydrophilic. This is at 45% relative humidity. That is really important, as I will show you. The average domain area is 94 square nanometers, 10.9 nanometer diameter average. And you get a distribution. So you don't just get one, you get a distribution. Okay, so then what we're interested in is how this is again the 45 nanometer, or 45% relative humidity image. How does this change as the relative humidity changes? And so we have a special device that will allow us to change the relative humidity of our, while we do AFM. And so when we remove the water content, this is 3% relative humidity, all of the channels go away. Eventually all of them will go away. Some of them remain in this image, and if you let this thing dry out, all the pores will close. And you'll no longer have any hydrophilic surface area. So you can get around this in a fuel cell by humidifying your gas stream. On the other hand, if you flood one side, that is make it higher relative humidity, which is always going to happen because on the cathode side you're making water, this is what happens. And this is a surprise, and this is the first time anything like this had ever been seen. Maybe we can get the lights dimmed the way it was with Professor Bazan's talk to see this better. And so here, this is at 98% relative humidity. You see the topography and the phase. So again, the darker regions here are the water or the hydrophilic regions. And you can see that now they look like these fibrils or these streams of water on the surface. We do see them in the topography, so they're at least able to be imaged by, they're higher in than the rest of the film. Normally the surface roughness is a few nanometers here, it's a lot larger, and you can see that there's a corresponding signature and height to each of these river-like features of water. This had been proposed by theorists, although these are much smaller than what we observe here. Previously, this is the first time this has ever been seen. And so now, the question is, this is good, right? We have more hydrophilic surface area, so we should have higher proton conductance. Okay, so we have to be able to prove that. And in order to do that, we use the atomic force microscope in what's known as its conductive probe realm. And to do this, we take our probe tip that I showed earlier and metallize it with platinum. And so in a sense, we have the bottom side, the anode side of our membrane electrode assembly with the cathode side removed, and now our tip is going to be a scanning cathode. Okay, so the idea then would be to let this go across the surface, and then because we can measure wherever there's a hydrophilic region, we should be able to see if it produces current by sensing the current in the AFM. And so it would be, and this is a one-dimensional hypothesis or cartoon of how you would see a signal here where the strength of the conductance would be reflected in the signal intensity. Okay, and then so you would say, well, these channels all conduct, and by correlating these things you can tell how many of them conduct and how many don't, and we've done those experiments, but what I talked about were these river-like features that occur in Nafion at high relative humidity. So do they conduct? And the answer is no, they don't. So even though the higher surface, so again, you can see these river-like features, and wherever there's one of these river-like features, we see no conductance. Even though we know that it has the phase signature of water, it doesn't result in electrochemistry. So no current is produced here. So even though you think it should be good, it's bad. Okay, so by several different techniques, we've proposed a model here, and I'll give you the result. So at ambient conditions, this is the height, This is the phase you've seen before. This would be a structure with the surface shown here. And then it undergoes some sort of phase transition where we think that it pulls polymer out of the membrane, and these are encased by at least a skin of the hydrophilic or the fluorocarbon, and then have water inside. Okay, that makes them strong enough to be imaged in topography, which we knew, and that's a thin enough skin that we still get the phase of water. Okay, so you can take these images, several of them, and get a correlation length out of this. We found it to be 80 nanometers. And this actually agrees pretty well with bulk measurements on Nafion films under hydrated conditions. So this is small angle X-ray scattering. This parameter lambda here tells you the number of water molecules per sulfonic acid group. So the larger or the more hydrated, you start seeing this increase, which is this shoulder here, which is approximately 80 nanometer correlation length. So this is something that was not known in this data that was published in the early 2000s, but we think this is due to these features that we see on the surface. Okay, so that's Nafion. Now I'm going to show you in the next few minutes, the last minutes of my talk, how you can use this diagnostic to look at other polymer films that are possible membranes for fuel cells. So the first one I'll talk about is a commercially available polymer. It's called HighFly ion. It was originally developed by Dow and then sold to Solexis, which is where we got it. And it's a similar polymer to Nafion, with the exception that it has this short side chain. So Nafion's side chain was twice as long as this. So that's the only difference. So this was known to be a better conductor at low relative humidity, but it was not known why it worked better at high relative humidity, and I think we can answer that. Okay, so this is the comparison between Nafion and HighFly ion under ambient conditions. They're very, very similar. But under low relative humidity, you can see that for HighFly ion, it starts to retain its structure. So this pore collapse is not nearly as strong in HighFly ion as it is in Nafion. But the other interesting thing is none of those fibril-like features or river-like features are observed in HighFly ion. So even though this is 40% hydrophilic for Nafion, most of this does not result in power generation. This, however, does. And that's the reason that HighFly ion works better at high humidity conditions. Okay, so to push this trend, we started collaborating with 3M that had their own polymer films that they used as membranes for fuel cells. And they make both the perfluorosulfonic acid polymer, which is this one here. So this would be another OH group. And this is a medium side chain length. So in between HighFly ion and Nafion. The other thing is, using this polymer, they can derivatize it with this group here and make multiple acid groups. So this is a perfluoroimide acid. And so we have more acid groups on this polymer film than here. And we can compare both of these, and that's next. Okay, so again, very robust polymer films, very high hydrophilic content under hydrated conditions, and very highly conductive. In fact, if you look at the conductance imaging, notice the scale here, 1.3 nanoamps versus 300 picoamps for the sulfonic acid to the imide acid. Very high conductance. So this diagnostic technique works very well for any polymer film that you might want to use in a fuel cell, and certainly has the right diagnostic trends as seen in the bulk measurements like the conductance. And so here's just some height histograms from those images on the previous one. And so AFM is a very good technique for imaging these nanoscale features and to get some understanding of the proton conductance in a variety of these polymer membranes used in fuel cells. And with that, I'll conclude. And this is Nick Economou here, who did all of the experiments that I talked about today. Thank you. Yeah. So the question I think that might answer that is only about 50% of the channels that are open at the surface actually result in conductance. I didn't show those measurements, but those were the first ones that we did with this technique. So that's certainly a limiting factor. Bulk conductance is really important, and it's not something that we measure with our technique.
How does the ionic conductivity of these fluorosulfonic acids, if they result in groups compared with lithium, for example?
I think it was about a factor of 5 increase.
Factor of 5 increase. I mean, the performance of this type of fuel cell is really dominated by the oxygen reduction.
Absolutely. The catalysts are important, no doubt.
I did notice that you were using platinum. There's been a lot of work on incorporating nitrogen and sulfur into carbons.
So we have a whole effort in this area I didn't talk about. And we've incorporated nitrogen into carbon for 2 reasons. One, to see if it actually acts as a catalyst. And the other thing is to improve the durability of platinum on the carbon substrate. And it does both.
There's some evidence that if you introduce those species into carbon, derivatize the carbon, you may have the opportunity eventually to eliminate precious metals, which would be a big deal.
Yes. And we're very interested in that.